In this session, we're going to look at variances. We'll start off by asking what a variance is. Well, it's a difference between what we expect or plan to happen and what actually does happen. They come in two different types. Adverse variances, which occur where the actual result is worse than we planned, or favourable variances, where our actual result is better than planned. The most basic type of variances are cost variances, and these would be calculated when we're reviewing how we've done, and we can calculate them by comparing two numbers. First of all, the standard material, labour or other cost, so we'll focus on one of those different types of costs, for actual production levels, and we'll compare that with the actual cost. Let's have a look at an example. So we've got a business that makes a product, and a standard unit of this product requires 4 kilograms of material, and the material costs £2 per kilogram. And at the end of a period, we looked at how many units we'd produced, and we see that we made 2,300 units, and we used 9,660 kilograms of material, which cost us £18,354. Now, from this information, we're going to calculate our materials cost variance. So the first thing that we need to do is calculate the standard materials cost of making those 2,300 units. Well, we'll first work out the standard materials quantity. Each unit should have taken or used 4 kilograms of material, so 2,300 units should have used 9,200 kilograms. Next, we can work out how much those 9,200 kilograms should have cost. The standard cost is £2 per kilogram, so those 9,200 kilograms should have cost us 18,400. But we can see that we actually spent £18,354 on our materials. So the difference between that standard cost of 18,400 and the actual cost is our variance, and the difference is £46, and it's a favourable variance because we actually spent less than we expected to. What we can now think about is whether we can split that cost variance into two different components. And this is possible, but only if we've got sufficient information. We can split the cost variance into usage or efficiency variances, which looks at the effect of the quantity of resources that's been used. And for materials, this would be called the materials usage variance, and for labour, it would be the labour efficiency variance. But they're both really measuring the same thing. The second types of variances we can calculate are the price or rate variances, and these look at the effects of the cost of the resources. And for materials, we'd call this the materials price variance, and for labour we'd refer to the labour rate variance. So how do we calculate these variances? Well, as before, we start with the standard cost of actual production. Again, we're then going to use how much we actually spent on this particular resource. And the difference between those, as we saw in the last example, is the cost variance. But in order to split this variance further, what we need is to calculate one additional number. And this is the quantity of the resource that was actually used at the standard rate for that resource. Once I've calculated that, well, the difference between my top two boxes, the standard cost of actual production and how much the quantity of resource that was used should have cost, that difference, the difference between those two numbers is my materials usage or labour efficiency variance. Then the difference between how much the quantity of resource that was used should have cost and the amount we actually spent, the difference between those two numbers is my materials price or labour rate variance. Let's have a look at an illustration. So we've prepared a budget based on standard costs, and we've also recorded what actually happened with regard to our labour. So we'd budgeted to produce 8,000 units, we actually made 8,300 units. We budgeted to use 20,000 hours in making those units, but we actually used 20,335 hours. And our budgeted labour cost was £200,000, but we actually spent £207,417. So what we would do first of all is work out some standard costs and usage from our budget, and we would calculate them from our budget. Our standard costs are not based on what's actually happened. So first of all, I could work out the standard hours required for a single unit. If it takes 20,000 hours to make 8,000 units, my standard hours per unit is 2.5 hours. I can then work out my standard cost per labour hour. So that's the budgeted labour cost of £200,000 divided by my budgeted labour hours of 20,000, or £10 per hour. I'm now in a position to calculate my variances. So first of all, there's my standard cost of actual production. So it's 8,300 units at 2.5 hours per unit. That enables me to calculate the total number of hours that should have been used to produce 8,300 units, and then I'll apply the standard cost per hour of £10 per hour, and that works out at £207,500. Next, I'll work out the actual number of hours that were used, that's £20,335, at the standard rate per hour of £10 per hour. And that works out at £203,350. And finally, I'll use the actual cost of £207,417. We can now calculate our labour rate variance and the labour efficiency variance. We'll start with the labour efficiency variance. That's the difference between the numbers in my top two boxes, and that's a variance of £4,150. Now it's favourable because the actual number of hours that we worked were fewer than the number of hours that we would have expected to be worked. Next, I can calculate my labour rate variance, and this is the difference between the bottom two boxes. So that's the difference between 203,350 and 207,417. Now here I've got a variance of 4,067, and this is adverse because the rate per hour is higher than expected. So it's slightly higher than £10 per hour. And that is how we calculate our labour efficiency variance and our labour rate variance. And the method The same method is used to calculate materials usage and materials price variances. Now that we've gone through that process, you might be thinking, well, so what? I've learnt how to calculate some variances, but what does it actually tell us? Well, splitting these variances, so splitting that cost variance into rate or price variances and usage or efficiency variances, does help us identify why that variance has happened. It might tell us that it's because we've been less or more efficient than expected with the use of our resource. Also, whether we're paying a higher or lower price per unit of resource than expected. So once we know this, we're then in a much better position to take appropriate action to either repeat favourable variances in the future or eliminate adverse variances.